Hey there.
Hi, Deborah.
Hello, Barry.
I'm happy to be here with one of my favorite people, although I think that we deserve a whiskey after today's news. What a day. Maybe let's start there. I'm sure that's what's on everyone's mind. Am I wrong? Yeah, that's of course what everyone's thinking about. Let's talk about Ilhan Omar's tweet, what she said, if it's anti-Semitic, and what that whole episode signifies.
It was clearly anti-Semitic. There was no question about it. It was even, what should we say, obnoxiously anti-Semitic, even if that's a repetitive term. You'd probably edit that out if you were editing me for the paper. But it's all about the Benjamins with the notes. I mean, I know it comes from a song. Someone just enlightened me about that. But still, it was really obnoxious. And I don't put much stock in her apology. I think the problem goes, I just came back from London yesterday where the book was launched this week in the UK. And of course there the question of Jeremy Corbyn comes up over and over again. And I think for people like Jeremy Corbyn and those around him, for people like Representative Omar, for Representative AOC, as I guess she's called here in her hometown, and for others like that, for some progressives, political progressives, their view of the world is refracted through a prism. You know, prisms bend light, if you remember your high school science. And that prism has two facets, ethnicity and class. They look at Jews and they see white people, which is ironic because the guy who came into Pittsburgh and committed the massacre, the murderer, saw Jews ruining the world for white people, but that's, you know, two separate views. They see white people and they see privileged people. Mm-hmm. So they say, if you're white and you're privileged, there's no way, it's categorically impossible for you to be a victim of prejudice. Therefore, your claims about anti-Semitism must be a shield, a foil for something else. Ha ha, Israel. And then on top of that, certainly someone like Jeremy Corbyn, and I think Representative Omar also, and some of the others, even though they're much younger than Corbyn, they say, you're accusing me of being prejudiced? You're accusing me of being anti-Semitic? That's impossible. You know, Jeremy Corbyn always boasts about his mother having marched at Cable Street, which is the anti-fascist marches. You know, I imbibed liberalism and anti-prejudice with my mother's milk. Representative Omar, I was a victim of prejudice. I was a refugee. It's impossible for me to be prejudiced. So A, it's impossible for me to be prejudiced. B, it's impossible for you to be a victim of prejudice. Something else is going on. And the minute you hear the money thing, warning bells should go off.
So it seems to me that in the Democratic Party, or maybe that's unfair, maybe let's just say on the parts of the left, you tell me which is more accurate. There's a zero tolerance policy when it comes to racism, as we saw in the reaction to Governor Northam's blackface from the time in medical school. And when he's criticized for that, it's a criticism, everyone agrees, based on morality, based on fighting against bigotry. Today, when Ilhan Omar was criticized by Nancy Pelosi and other leaders in Congress, the reaction from parts of the left was, aha, see? This proves the power that the Jews and the pro-Israel lobby have. Mm-hmm. What are we meant to do to that?
Well, let me just
respond to that.
I think you're absolutely right for your analysis there, but remember that the same thing happens on the right. When Donald Trump, the candidate, is enthusiastically endorsed by David Duke, and he's asked, what do you do with his endorsement? And he says, well, I don't really know who David Duke is, so I don't want to comment. Of course, even though 5 years earlier he'd condemned David Duke and condemned the Republican Party for making common cause with David Duke. And when he's criticized for it, and he finally issues a rather tepid condemnation of David Duke, all those people on the far right say, the Jews forced them into it. So I had a professor in graduate school, Ben Halpern, who used to say the one place the far right and the far left meet is in the hatred of Jews. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that. We see it in France. We see it in lots of places. So, but I think there is there is a sense that of not taking anti-Semitism seriously. And if you don't take anti-Semitism seriously, and you see these group of people completely apoplectic as to what's going on here, you say, what's wrong with them? You know, what's their problem? And I happen to think the statement by the Democratic leadership was very strong.
But don't you think they should remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee, as they remove Steve King from his positions?
I think that would not be a incorrect move, to put it that way. I think it would be the right thing to do. I think she unless you want to say she's, everybody's going to be watching everything she does so closely that, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So, it was a stunning moment. It was stunning also in her naivete, and she's not naive. You don't get elected if you're naive. But I guess naive is the wrong word, but just that for her...
How bald it was? Is that what you mean?
Well, for her, how this was just a given. That, of course, if it's about the Jews and about Israel, it's about money.
Well, let's put aside the money part for a second, because that in a way is easy, because that's a classic anti-Semitic trope.
Right.
The harder thing, right, is and the hypnotized, which I wrote a column about, Israel's hypnotized the world. Again, classic anti-Semitic trope. The thing that's actually harder is the content, right? Israel's hypnotized the world. Okay, we all see that, classic. In order to masquerade the evil doings of Israel. That's the part that's become sort of more and more normative, at least in the circles that I travel in on the progressive left. Many of the people who swim in those waters are young Jews who are increasingly moving toward, I don't know if you want to call it anti-Semitism, BDS curious. What do you say to those young people? You like that?
Very good, very good.
They all heard BDSM curious.
Yes, right.
What do you say to those young people, many of whom I imagine are on your campus?
Right.
And
No,
students of yours?
it's a very hard thing. There is a growing sense of distance with Israel, not with its policies, because you read Haaretz and you see a distance with Israeli policy. You go to the Knesset and listen to the debates there and you'll see it. But there's a growing disillusionment, a growing sense that Israel is always wrong. Now, Israel sometimes is wrong, and it's done some very wrong things, passed some very stupid and counterproductive bills. Its contemporary leadership has made common cause with people who are anti-Semites.
Like Viktor Orban.
Or Viktor Orban, the leadership of Poland, in a way
Brazil.
that... Brazil, absolutely. I mean, it's common cause. You can say, well, yes, they support Israel, but if you're going to claim to be... Israel's going to claim to be the leading force for fighting anti-Semitism. You don't make common cause with Viktor Orban, who uses overtly anti-Semitic tropes, in form of George Soros and things like that. But it's a very difficult moment because I'm older. I was in Israel during the Six-Day War. You weren't even around till long after that. But we've watched the Israel change. Israel was very popular. I think Israel's height of popularity was before June 5th, 1967, when it looked like it was going to be destroyed. Many people love dead Jews. They love Jewish tombstones that get knocked over that they can...
the Jews were never more popular among the progressive left than in the days after the Pittsburgh Massacre.
That's right. Jew is victim.
Yes.
And it's very hard to reconcile that, even people who don't want Jew to be victim, but they want to protect the Jew. The strong, brash, outspoken Jew is something that is disturbing, is dislocating, discomforting. So I don't know, but what I would say to these young people is I would point out to them, first of all, something that was pointed out to me by a new figure in the fight against anti-Semitism in Britain. I was with her on Saturday night in London, Rachel Riley. Some of you may know her name. She's a math genius, Oxford grad, tall, beautiful, all those things.
Does not hurt.
No, it does not hurt at all. But also she figures out these complicated math things on television. She's a long-term member of the Labor Party, and she recently criticized the party for its anti-Semitism and said, "I'm a Jew." You know, even though my name is Rachel Riley, I'm a Jew. And she was subjected to the worst trolling. The worst trolling. She just was shocked by it, which only drove her further away from the party and further into this critique, or a stronger critique of the party. But she pointed out something very interesting to me. She said, you know, when people talk about Israel, one of the first things they often do is say, now look, I don't agree with all of Israel's policies, but you can't criticize, you know. She said, I never heard anybody who, like Jeremy Corbyn, who embraces Hamas, saying, now look, I don't believe in terrorism, but Hamas does good things. You know, there's that beginning, that we begin with that apologia. We begin with that apology. I don't believe in everything Israel does, but this is too much, which doesn't exist on the other side. So I point out to the students, I say, wait a minute. First of all, this myopic view of Israel, myopic concentration on Israel to the exclusion of others. And I'm not talking about Sudan and Syria, because those are not countries Israel, I think, necessarily wants to be compared to. But students who will take examples like Ari Shavit explored in his book, you know, where there were wrongs committed by, you know, Haganah and Palmach and other Jewish fighters in the establishment of the state, like with the city of Lud, where the Arabs were. Sometimes the Arabs left because their leadership said to them, leave and you'll be back in a week and you can take all the Jewish property. And sometimes they were kicked out. So people say, well, how could you support a state that did that? And I said, you know, you're right. But let's do it, let's be equitable here, and let's look at other states that did that and criticize them and not support them and question their right to exist. And I'll say, well, we could start with the United States, then we could move to Canada, then we could do Australia, then we could do the United Kingdom and how it divided, you know, Pakistan and India. In other words, this myopic view, something's wrong. There have been a number of stories in the New York Times in recent weeks on the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. Shouldn't that be? I mean, you know, I just heard a story last week of a high school student here in New York City, in a public high school, who wanted to do a summer program in Israel and needed a letter of recommendation. Mm-hmm. So she went to her teacher, happened to be a Jew, and said, will you write this letter of recommendation for me first? He said, of course. She brought the form, and he said, oh, I don't write for Israel.
That happened in Michigan with a few
Well, in
students
Michigan,
too.
right. It happened in Michigan in a university, but here it happened in New York, in the heart of a New York City public school, you know, a Jewish teacher, but exactly the same kind of thing. Well, this student had moxie. I want to find her and bring her to Emory. This student had moxie, and she said to the her high school teacher, is there any other country you wouldn't write a letter for? She said, for instance, I want to go to North Korea. He thought about it. He said, no, I don't know of any other country I wouldn't write a letter for. He said, you know, but of course, this is the one about which there's a lot of talk and there's, you know, opposition. I mean, it was the most utter stupid thing, but this is more and more common in what we're seeing.
If anyone knows that student, I would welcome an op-ed from
Yeah,
the New York Times. No, seriously.
We'll find out. She belongs to Central, so you can find out who it is.
Yeah, I think we have a Central person right here.
Yeah, right. So it just was, it's this amazing myopia, only Israel. Not only Israel is the wrongdoer in the world, but Israel as the sole wrongdoer in this conflict. Palestinians haven't done anything. Both sides have screwed up. Both sides have, you know, made decisions which moved it away from peace process. But according to the critics, it's all Israel. This naive notion, oh, let's create one state, you know, where everybody will have democratic rights. You name for me one other state with with a Muslim majority where a minority religion is thriving. The only one I can name is the Jewish state, you know, in which the Arabs, difficult circumstances, and certainly if you live in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, occupied territories, whatever you want to call it. I think I've hit all the bases there. But that sole blame on Israel. And the idea, well, this shouldn't be a state. You know, what was it, Helen Thomas? Let them all go back to Poland. which she said, remember
Yes,
her famous
I do.
statement. But ignoring the fact that over 50% of the Israeli population
Is
are people of
Mizrahi.
color,
Yeah.
Mizrahi, Yemenite, Ethiopian. So, I mean, it's just, it's so crazy. It makes so little sense that it's just like anti-Semitism. You know, it's a conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is illogical.
Do you mean to hedge there when you say it's just like
No, I'm
anti-Semitism?
just trying to be
Clever.
right, clever, right. I'd met my match there.
No, I'm saying, so when a student comes to you and says, Deborah, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just
First
an
of all, they'd say
anti-Zionist.
Professor Lipstadt. but
Excuse me.
you're right.
Excuse me. Professor Lipstadt, put in my place. I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just an anti-Zionist. I'm a proud Jew. I mean, I meet a lot of people like this
Yes.
increasingly on college campuses.
The yes but. And I say, well,
10 years ago, let me put it to you another way. 10 years ago, or whatever, I guess it's maybe 15 now, when I was on a college campus, I refused to say that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism, both because I don't think I was politically confident enough yet, and because, you know, there are the Bundists, and there are the anarchists.
and
there
the
are,
Satmar.
Yes, and there's some exception. Now I feel very comfortable saying that. I'm wondering where you are on that question.
I've come to that. I've also evolved to that. Look, if you were an anti-Zionist in 1941, 42, you didn't think there should be a Jewish state. Even in 45, 46, that's one thing. But today there's a Jewish state with what's the Jewish population of Israel?
6 million.
6 million, 7
More than
million.
6 million.
Where are they supposed to go? What do you mean I don't believe in a Jewish state? It exists. Well, it's a theocracy, as some of these new members of Congress said. Well, it's anachronistic because it's a theocracy. How many Muslim states are there? You know, I think the important thing, one of the tactics, let me put it that way, is to show people how ludicrous the criticism is, how out of whack the criticism is. Are we going to change everybody's mind? No, because there's some people who are just wrapped up in this. But it's the same way, I'm going to say, to differentiate, lahavdil, a little bit. When I dealt with people who were intrigued by deniers' arguments. And I used to, bring out all sorts of documents, look at this document, look at that document. My basic argument now is that for deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? First of all the German documents, but survivors, bystanders, the people who lived in, the town of Treblinka, the city of Svechim, saw the trains going in day after day, filled with people coming out empty. Historians, every historian, hundreds of thousands of historians who have worked on this. North America, Europe, Israel, South America, Australia, China, Japan, would either have to be part of the hoax or have been duped. And most of all, the perpetrators. In not one war crimes trial since the end of World War II did a perpetrator ever stand up and say it didn't happen. They said, I didn't do it, I was forced, but never did. Where's their evidence? Where's their narrative? It doesn't exist. So I try to show my students the idiocy of Holocaust denial, the idiocy and the danger of Holocaust denial. And I think one of the things we have to do is show people the idiocy and the danger of anti-Semitism. Jews are communists, Jews are capitalists. Jews are pushy and want to be in clubs that nobody wants them in. Jews are clannish and stick together. Well, last time I checked, you can't be a communist and a capitalist, pushy and clannish at the same time. To show people the utter ridiculousness of it. And I think that's part of the answer. It's not the whole answer, and I'll be intrigued to read your book, How to Fight It. You would think that after 3.5 years of working on this, I would have easy answers. I don't have easy answers. I do think there's certain things we have to do. I think we have to become what I call the unwelcome guest at the dinner party. That whereas, think of the dinner party where someone says, look, XYZ is coming and they're a racist, they're a misogynist, they're an anti-Semite.
100%.
Right, and the host or the hostess says to you, look, just ignore them. because we just don't want to get into a fight. And we used to be, we could do, can't do that anymore.
I had a very specific example of this where a good friend of mine, her brother-in-law, showed up to a dinner wearing a Jeremy Corbyn t-shirt. And the question was, it's a very interesting story. She's marrying someone who's converting, and he understood the problem, but this was someone who was wearing the shirt probably not knowing the implications of it. Mm-hmm. And she asked me, what do we do? Do we be the skunk at the garden party, or do we just sort of let it pass?
I think we beat the skunk. Now, if he didn't know what he was doing, there's one way of approaching it. A friend was telling me that, her Israeli husband was going to buy something, and the guy who was doing it, or they were negotiating over some work to be done at the house, and said, well, don't Jew me down, knowing to whom he was speaking. Now, sometimes people do it without even thinking about what they're saying. I have the book, as you know, is in letters, and I have one example in there where the student, it's between me, as you know, between a Jewish student and a non-Jewish colleague and myself talking about issues. So at one point, the student comes to me and says, I have roommates who have talked about Jewing down, and you're a prince, you're a Jewish American princess, and all these kind of things. What do I do? And I said, go back and show them how that's anti-Semitic. Show them, work with them on that. Now, I've gotten, most of the reviews have been exceptionally positive, including from your paper. But one of the bad reviews, isn't it funny to come and talk about all, this is going to be a good session to talk about, was the Jerusalem Post. Now this, person in the Jerusalem Post said, I would have told her, go find new friends. Don't go reason with your roommates and friends. Well, it happens to be that that's based on a real incident. A student came to me and said, my roommates are making these kind of cracks and statements. They say, we love you, but that. And I said, go back and show them X, Y, and Z. And it worked.
But the real challenge, right, in my view, is not what I think of as country club anti-Semitism, or someone calling you a Jap, or things that maybe hurt your pride but aren't an existential threat. The real challenge, right, is whatever it is, 74% of Jewish Americans vote for Democrats. Basically everyone, I imagine in this room, many people in this room, travel in very liberal circles. And let's face it, it's very, very easy socially to call out Steve King when you're aligned with other progressives, and it is very, very difficult to call out Tamika Mallory, which is, I think, part of the reason that it took so long for that story to bubble up.
To emerge. People were afraid.
What do you advise to those people, meaning certain people in this room, I imagine, me, you, who are worried about losing their social capital or their friends, honestly, when they speak up. And by the way, you do lose your friends. I've lost more friends in the past 2 years than I have my entire life.
Former friends. I know I've met many people say, oh, Barry Weiss, I used to be your friend. So.
At least I still have you. I mean, hopefully.
Well, no, that's for sure. That's for sure.
I'm saying there's a sacrifice. There is a sacrifice, so let's speak to that.
Yeah, but those, first of all, if that's how those people feel, are they really people you want as your friends?
You don't need to, I know my answer to that question. Yeah. I've made my choice. My question is, speak to the person that feels like they're closeting themselves in those conversations. Because
they don't want to say, they say, I don't want to make a, I don't want to be right. No, or the students on campus who feel, the no red tape students at Columbia, the students who are protesting the administration's treatment of women students who came and or any student who came and reported sexual abuse. And I spoke to one of the students who was involved in it, and she told me, Ricky, I'm blocking on her last name. You probably know her. She wrote for Tablet. And
Novetzky?
Yes, that's it. And she told me that, went to no red tape meetings protesting the Columbia administration's policy on and treatment of issues relating to anti-Semitism. And suddenly she's listening to this harangue about how Israel is, should be eliminated, et cetera. People go to LGBTQ meetings and there's these attacks on Israel, and you want to say, where would you rather be a gay person? In downtown Amman, not to speak of Cairo, or in Tel Aviv, gay haven of the world.
But what you're describing is the choice being put increasingly to Jews who believe in the right of Jewish self-determination in the state of Israel and are also progressive. If you want to enter the door of progressive spaces, increasingly what's being asked of you is you have to check your Jewish particularism at the door. Should we continue to force our way into those rooms, or should we find different rooms?
That's a very good question. I would say some people will continue to force themselves, and I think it's not a bad thing that some people be there, but they be there as Jews. They be there as Jews. I'm not going to check my credentials at the door. If it gets too exhausting, then find another room with the same values. The Women's March, I would never have gone to Washington. The first time I was in Poland when the march took place, but the second time I would never have gone. But I believe in the values. I believe in the professed values of what they were marching for. So don't give up on the fight. Don't throw out the baby with the bath, to use the cliche. And I hope that some people will stay in there. I have friends in England who have stayed in the Labour Party, fighting from within. Also because they feel that there's no real chance for a second party to have any political viability, and all we'll do is, create a better chance for the Tories to get back in, and then there'll be Brexit, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know if I could do it.
So let's broaden out for a minute. I mean, you're one of the people that I email and call when I'm in despair. And I was talking to another one of our friends.
Isn't that nice relationship? She's in despair. Call Lipstadt, right?
You help light the fire under my ass when I need it. That's a mitzvah. It's the 614th.
Right.
So I was talking to someone and I was like, oh my God, the Jews are in a vise. Look what's happening. The right is given over to Trumpism. The left is giving itself over to Corbynism. In my view, could only, depending on how much we resist it. What are we going to do? And he goes, no, it's the Jewish return to history. The Jews, he was suggesting to me, have sort of been on a holiday from history for the past 70 years, mostly because Israel sort of did its job so well and so fast that Jews my age and younger think of it as sort of like being as certain as gravity, that Jews in the West
are equal and
equal, powerful, privileged, prosperous, and that what we're seeing now that's causing me, and I'm sure many people in this room, and you, such alarm, is just sort of the return to the norm. I wondered if you could address that.
I'm not that pessimistic.
Good.
It sounds strange after all these years of working on this topic. I also don't think we ever really emerged from that history. Yes, there was a certain sense the past maybe 30 years in America with the resurgence of university campuses, which used to strictly restrict the number of Jews having Jewish presidents. I remember the description when the president of Dartmouth, first Jewish president of Dartmouth, had his menorah collection at the entrance to the president's house, or kosher meals in a president's house of a university where the founders were probably turning, and long after the founders were turning over there in their graves. We've seen things, we've seen accomplishments. For some Jews, this is what they call in Hebrew, chatzi nechama, half a consolation. But when people list members of other ethnic and religious groups that they would be happy for their children to marry, Jews are always at the top. Doesn't make the rabbis happy, but it shows a certain degree of acceptance. But I don't think this is just a return to history. My sense is that this is something the same yet different. This is old wine in new bottles. And to some degree, it feels like this is a perfect storm. We've had anti-Semitism from the left. God knows we've had it from the right but now at both time, to have it both at the same time. And of course the third direction, which is sometimes, more politically incorrect to mention, but from Islamist extremists, and not just Islamic extremists, and I want to be very careful here because it's so easy to be misunderstood, from sectors of the Muslim community into whom anti-Semitism has been inculcated,
Yes.
planted by, whether it's by an imam, whether it's by publications. I was in Sweden 10 days ago, and I was talking to the rabbi at the Great Synagogue, and she told me that she has members of her congregation who are school teachers. And they teach, she said, not in Stockholm Central, but in the southern part, where there are, I think what they're called euphemistically in Sweden, are new citizens, refugees, Muslim refugees. And they do not tell the students in their class that they are Jewish. They don't mention it, they don't indicate it in any way, and if the parents do find out, sometimes there'll be complaints. That teacher can teach my kid math and science, but how can they teach them World War II history?
Let's talk about Europe and go a little bit more deep into it. The news item that was overlooked in the Ilhan Omar story of today was the fact not only that there were Jewish graffiti, which has become a daily thing, anti-Semitic graffiti, excuse me, on Jewish
Bondi
bagel
Beach,
shops.
right?
Oh yeah, no, but in Paris today.
Oh yes. Yeah.
But there was, this one broke my heart. There was a tree planted in dedication to Ilan Halimi, and that tree was chopped down today in Paris. Jeff Goldberg wrote an article in 2014 that was very provocative at the time, that was called, "Is it time for the Jews to leave Europe?"
Yes.
Has that question been answered?
I've been in Europe a lot lately, and I would hate to see that happen. I would hate to see that happen. There are Jewish communities that, they're hanging on by their fingernails.
And they're living in the closet.
Some are living in the closet, some are not. But yes, more and more, you don't wear a kippah in the street, you don't wear a Jewish star. Yet here I am, I should be the ultimate pessimist, having just written this book and feeling as I do. I would feel very sad if we saw the end of these communities. Jews have been there too damn long. We're too much a part of the history. They've given so much. To be driven out, I think, would be a wrong thing. It's not easy. There are parts, you hear stories. This book, I finished, I was doing the page proofs in mid-August, and I kept adding stuff because, Corbyn goes to Tunis and the Palestinian, the Munich massacre people, and honors them. Benjamin Netanyahu welcomes Viktor Orban to Israel as a great fighter against anti-Semitism. Every day there would be something to be added. And finally, in the beginning of September, my editor said, "Deborah, you got to send it to us, or we're not going to meet the pub date." And it was already in the catalogs, et cetera, et cetera. So September, 4th, 5th, 6th, I hit the send button. And then at the end of October, we both were in Phoenix at the same conference, and came Pittsburgh. And when one of your colleagues from the Times called me, Laurie Goodstein, I think it was, to ask me what I said, I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised. You study this. I described for her, and then I wanted to take it back, even though I hadn't said off the record, She said, no, it's a perfect description. I said, anti-Semitism is like herpes. And it's disgusting, but I hear there's actually medication that can cure herpes, but until very recently, if you had herpes, this is serious. I'm not being funny here. If you had herpes,
Please, no one tweet this analogy.
right. If you had herpes, it never went away. We all heard those horror stories of the person about to be interviewed, big interview, really nervous, and suddenly they wake up in the morning with a herpes sore or something. Because when there's tension, it comes out. Anti-Semitism is like that infection for the world. When there's tension, political tension, economic tension, social tension, it's so easy to rely on it. If you said it's all the fault of the bicycle riders, as the famous joke, that was supposedly told by Jews in Germany goes, people would say, it's crazy. But if you say it's the fault of the Jews, it makes sense. You know, I don't have to tell you that for prejudice to take hold, it's got to make sense. Every prejudice, every prejudicial stereotype has its standard tropes. If you're engaging in a racial against African Americans, shiftless, lazy, welfare cheats, there are certain words that the prejudicial person knows to push because they push the button. If you're talking about Jews, it's money, power, intellect, but that power, nefarious use of that power, malicious use of that power. With the racist is punching down. If we let those people into our gene pool, however it is, they're going to take us down. The anti-Semite is punching up. Those
Right.
Jews are smart. They're deceptive. You know, the eternal Jew, the famous, where those Jews know how to manipulate. You can't quite track where it's coming from. It's all classic.
Just to push a little bit on the question of the Jews of Europe, should the Jews of Europe stay in those countries that they're in because they have every right to live out their lives as Jews wherever they want? Or do you think that, or to what extent is it also about the health of those countries themselves if they become places that
Without
Jews?
Well, I think both those things. Look, it's hard. It's easy for me to say to someone, who's in a small Jewish, you stay here because it's so important for you to stay here. Although I'm going back to New York or even Atlanta or something like that. But I do think there is something to that. But I think the second point is one of the main arguments we should be making, or one of the reasons why the whole world should be apoplectic about this rise of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. The reason to be upset about anti-Semitism is not, of course, if you're Jew, it's because your own ox is being gored. That's a good reason, but it's not a sufficient reason. Or maybe you have Jewish friends, Jewish neighbors, Jewish relatives today, and you worry about them. Good, but not sufficient. You hate all forms of prejudice. If there's prejudice, I'm going to fight it. Good, but not sufficient. The reason people should be terribly concerned about anti-Semitism and really fighting it is that no democratic society can harbor anti-Semitism in its midst and be considered a healthy democratic society. If the people in that society are going to fall prey to this conspiracy myth, which is anti-Semitism, then they're going to fall prey to conspiracy myths about the economy, about the society, about politics. It shows that something is rotten to the core.
So Trump, as we know, is someone who has sort of willfully engaged in conspiracy-minded thinking.
That's right.
Prayer rugs at the border, we could go on and on and on. Someone said something very wise, I don't remember who it was, that Trump is basically it's like you can be anti-Semitic without the Jews, meaning if you inculcate an atmosphere of conspiracy-minded thinking, those who are anti-Semitic will be drawn to your banner.
That's right.
Because they'll hear in it the siren song.
That's right.
To what extent, though, has Trump a symptom of something that we weren't sort of awake to?
I think he picked up on something.
Okay. I
think he, whatever his other intellectual, he doesn't read, which he says quite openly, etc. No, he says that. But he has a sense for the crowd. Mm-hmm. And when he went out to those rallies and engaged in that racist kind of talk, and that jingoistic, make America great again, and other things like that, it resonated. Mm-hmm. And he built on it. I have no idea whether he's an anti-Semite or not. I tend to believe not. I think he's very proud of his daughter having converted, and a Jewish son-in-law and Jewish grandchildren. But that's not the question. It's not the question about Trump. It's not the question about Jeremy Corbyn. I don't care what they are in their hearts. It's immaterial to me. That's between them and their cardiologist, But it's what they do, what they enable. There's a term, that I'm sure you heard in Pittsburgh, a Kochlöffel, the cooking spoon, the stirrer up of the pot. And on both the right and the left, we have seen, certainly these two gentlemen, a lot of people around them, willing to stir up the pot if it's going to make their base feel closer to them. And one of the ways you stir up the pot is you engage in tropes and memes and whatever that have that anti-Semitic theme, even at the same time as you may be a great supporter of Israel.
So you brought up one side, the other side. The typical thing that I've been talking about since Trump was elected, and we've seen the rise of anti-Semitism, and certainly I've been talking about this since Pittsburgh, is, we have the threat from the right, which frames us as globalists, and we have the fight from the left, which frames us as nationalists and particularists. You know that well. But let's say that I'm God, and you're the general of the Jews, and I grant you the power to destroy one of those sides. Just one. You can't hedge.
Whoa.
Which one are you going to destroy?
I thought this was going to be a friendly interview.
You're the most valuable voice on this. I need to get some wisdom so I can use it in other things.
I'll quote Henry Kissinger when the war between Iraq and Iran was going on. He said, "Too bad both sides can't lose."
I know what he said, but you're evading my. Okay, I'll give you an example. I met earlier. Was it this week? No, I'm losing track of days. Last week with a senior Israeli government official who we were talking. I was saying to him how disturbed I was by Israel's cozying up to far right, I would even say fascistic leaders. And he said, "Barry, what's worse, Viktor Orban or Jeremy Corbyn?" The answer to him being extremely obvious, that it's Jeremy Corbyn.
Corbyn, right.
I see that argument. I see it, meaning if I'm the choice and I'm making some realpolitik decisions and I'm Israel and I'm thinking about survival, I'm not saying I would do the same thing, but I see it. So I'm just wondering if you can respond to that a little more. Because I
think the cozying, I agree with you 100%. I think the cozying up of, to Orban, that was Eliyahu. Eliyahi. The cozying up to Viktor Orban, the Israeli government's treatment of the Polish Holocaust law, the relations with Brazil, Austria, AFD even, less so, but I'm sure that's coming as well, is very disturbing. I was watching a documentary, it was an old documentary, but on the alt-right last night. And I was listening to Richard Spencer, the creator of the alt-right, who was that clean-cut Nazi,
who calls himself a white Zionist.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
There's a lot of them.
That's right. That we want to create an ethno-state just like Israel created.
Yes.
We want to create. They love Israel. They hate Jews, but they love Israel. No, it's really true.
They love Israel for all the wrong reasons.
For all the wrong reasons. And I think this making common cause with Orban, talking about Orban as a great fighter against anti-Semitism, Orban has engaged in the most overt anti-Semitism and softcore Holocaust denial. Softcore Holocaust denial, some of you have seen the memorial that he built in the monument that he built right in the center of Budapest to World War II, which depicts the Hungarians as victims. Now, when the Germans came into Hungary in mid-March of 1944, Eichmann followed a few days later. They went into Hungary because they were afraid the Hungarians were going to flip sides and join the Allies. At that point, they were allied with the Germans. Eichmann followed a few days later with 300 SS officers. That was the end of March. Beginning of May, they began the deportations. In 7 weeks, they deported 500,000 people, of whom over 400,000 were murdered in Auschwitz. It's really what gives Auschwitz its dubious distinction as, the killing fields, the worst killing fields in the world. You don't do that with 300 people. You need the support of Hungarian gendarmes. You need the support of Hungarian railways. You need the support of Hungarian citizens, Hungarian bureaucrats. They were all in on Hungarian fascists. Orban is now creating a mythic history where we were all victims of the Germans. The Poles are doing something similar. The Poles did not have their own state as the Hungarians did, and there are 6,700 Poles commemorated at Yad Vashem as Tzadikei Umot Olam, righteous Gentiles who saved Jews. But there were many more Poles who collaborated, who turned in Jews for a couple of zloty. You know, there's a Jew here, there's a Jew there. There was, I'm sure you saw it, a recently declassified State Department report from 1945 of an American diplomat reporting on Poland and saying Jews who survived the camps are desperately trying to get to Germany because they're afraid of their Polish neighbors. You know, think about the absurdity of that. But when the Poles take this Holocaust law, which says you can't talk about Poles collaborating, and change it from criminal to civil and change one or two other slight cosmetic things, Israel embraces it. Now, I know Realpolitik, as this high-ranking Israeli official might have said to you, we know who our friends are, and we're more likely to get a vote from Poland in our favor and from Hungary in our favor than from France or Germany or whatever. But still, on the issue of anti-Semitism, Israel, it breaks my heart. I'm not just dealing gratuitous, beating up on the Netanyahu government at all, but it breaks my heart that Israel, which presents itself as if Jews are being, discriminated against, persecuted because of anti-Semitism, we will be there making this common cause.
So we haven't even mentioned the book barely, so we should do that.
I would appreciate it.
Let's do it.
My publisher is here.
I just could talk to you forever. Why did you write this book? And one of the most interesting lines in it is, even as you're writing a book about anti-Semitism, you say, anti-Semitism is not actually the biggest threat. I wondered if you could address both of those topics.
Why did I write the book? Because shortly after the Gaza war, I had an op-ed in the New York Times, which got a tremendous amount of attention, talking about the rise of anti-Semitism, and saying that I, for years, had been one of those who's saying the Jewish community should not build its identity. Dear me, the sky is falling. Every Yom Kippur for the Israeli bonds appeal, the rabbi would stand there and say, it's worse now than it's ever been. And I'd look around and I'd say, that doesn't comport with reality. But I'm saying now I'm beginning to think twice, and it's not just Gaza. The murder at the Brussels Jewish Museum was May, and Gaza was in the summer. I mean, you had many things. Ilan Halimi was long before. So I just said something is happening here. Well, I sent off the op-ed, and my literary agent, who is also sitting here someplace, called me and said, so where's the book proposal? So I said, what? He said, isn't this the beginning of a book? I said, Gary, I don't want to spend 3 years cavorting in the sewers of anti-Semitism. Bad enough I write about the Holocaust. He said, no, you got to do it. He pressed. So I came up with the book proposal. We sold it, and I had to write the book. But it was a tough book to write, and I couldn't figure out why. I'd written about Holocaust deniers. I'd been on trial in a lawsuit for 6 years, and in a trial for 10 weeks with one of the world's leading Holocaust deniers. Why was this so hard? Because all that stuff is about the past. This is about the present and the future. But if it was a hard book to write, it was a harder book to finish for exactly the reasons I mentioned, all those things that kept happening. But I said, just before I sent it off, I added this paragraph to the introduction. I'm a historian, I don't predict, but in this case, I'm willing to predict that by the time this book appears, something will have happened that should have been included. And then came Pittsburgh. But I say in there that anti-Semitism isn't the greatest problem. Recently, someone told me that when Edgar Bronfman became head of the World Jewish Congress, he went to meet with the Rav, with Rabbi Soloveitchik, and leading figure, towering figure in modern Orthodox life and beyond that as well. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said to Edgar, remember that Jews were not put on this earth just to fight anti-Semitism. And the last chapter of the book talks about joy versus oi, and it's so easy to become captive of the oi because, first of all, fear is a great equalizer. You don't have to know a page of Talmud to recognize an anti-Semite and want to fight an anti-Semite. Moreover, I remember there's a leading figure in the Jewish community who told me in his first marriage, he had 2 boys in his first marriage, and he came from a pretty strong Jewish background, but he never educated them. And he said, but if ever there is a moment that Jews are oppressed, they will be there. They will be at the barricades. They will fight. They cannot abide anti-Semitism. And he said it with great pride. And my heart was breaking.
Yes.
Because they didn't have all the good stuff. For them, Jew was object, not subject. It's what's done to Jews and not what Jews do. And I think we have, and I come from a tradition, a family of learning, of celebrating who we are as Jews, not being Jews because of anti-Semitism, being Jews despite anti-Semitism, because of all the good things that we've given to the world, all the good things that are ours, that are our tradition, the values. I mean, you articulated so beautifully on Bill Maher when you appeared after Pittsburgh, that all the values the Jews have brought to the world, and the values which are ours. If we turn ourselves solely into victims, we've ceded to the oppressor control over identity. We feel Jewish when they come out of the woodwork and not the other times. So while we have to fight this, we also have to balance it with the positive.
That's such a good place to end, but I'm not letting you go just yet, even though, by the way, this clock is stopped, so tell me what time it is.
It's 8:27.
Oh, good, I have time.
Yeah.
But that is stopped, so tell me when it's 8:45. Let's do a lightning round of good for the Jews, bad for the Jews. Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner. Bad for the Jews.
Okay.
Bad for America. Bad for America, that's who.
The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Good for the Jews. I love it.
Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman.
Bad for the world.
Sheryl Sandberg.
She screwed up on some of this stuff, but I think she's a proud Jew.
Benjamin Netanyahu.
Which one? The one who was elected 16 years ago or whatever it is? Right now, I think, though I wouldn't want his job for love or money or anything, right now I think not great.
The Jewish establishment, the alphabet soup organizations that are meant to be our leaders. Are they doing a good job? And you don't have to answer that one short. Let's actually get into that.
I think they face a very difficult situation. I think to some degree there's a need, and they recognize it. This morning at Federation, I met with a group of really young people who are emerging leaders, philanthropists. I think there's a recognition of the need to nurture that. I think some organizations, their mandate has passed and they haven't. But I think some of the organizations do terrific work. It's very easy to beat up on them. It's very easy to beat up on the leaders kind of thing. I saw when I faced this legal conundrum, and my lawyers called me who had been working pro bono, and they said, we can't work pro bono anymore because this is all we're doing. And we've got to raise some money. I said, could you be more specific? And he said, a lot. I said, more specific than that. He said, well, at least $1 million. I remember it was £1 million or dollars, but I heard $1 million, I stopped listening. At that point, I happened to be on my way to a Wexner Heritage Retreat. And people heard about what was happening, and someone told Rabbi Herbert Friedman, who was a leader of the Jewish community, a leader of UJA, a chaplain in World War II, a towering man. And he called me over. He said, what's going on here? And I told him the story of what was happening. And he said, well, it's time to get organized. And he called Les Wexner. And Les Wexner asked for some briefing materials, which I prepared. Les and Abigail knew me well. I'd been teaching for the foundation for quite a while. And Les said, Abigail and I could write out this check, finished, done. He said, but this has got to be this can't, when this story is told, and not knowing it would be a movie and it would be all the things, but he said, when this story is told, it can't be the story of two Jews in Columbus, Ohio, helping a Jew in Atlanta to fight the world's leading anti-Semite. It's got to be a community effort. And then my lawyer said, that's great, but it's got to be done quietly. It can't, because this crazy man, David Irving, if he knows you're supported, he's less likely to drop the case, which of course we initially hoped he would. So quietly, organizations, individuals, some of the people sitting in this room, just stepped up to the plate. And within, I don't know, 3 months, the money was there. And in the beginning, I started to write thank you notes to people because I got the lists from the American Jewish Committee, housed the money and arranged for everything. And one day Les called me and said, Deborah, your job is to fight. Our job is to give you the means to fight. Forget the thank you notes. And he still speaks about this, and many people said that it's the most important check he ever wrote. So I don't belittle the organized Jewish community. We have problems, we have flaws, we make mistakes. But when there's a need, whether it's an Ethiopian airlift, when there's a crushing disaster or whatever, the community is there. And it'd be easy to say, get rid of all the organizations. But we need to update, we need to change, we need young leadership in it. But no, I think it's a good thing.
Let's do some quick questions
Okay.
from everyone here. As concerned Jews and deeply involved members of the New York Jewish community, what actions can we take to fight anti-Semitism? What steps can we take?
Well, I think being the unwelcome guest at the dinner party, but knowing what to say. Not just, that's wrong and it hurts my feelings. Hurting your feelings is not the right answer. Learning how to identify anti-Semitism. What makes it anti-Semitism? Maybe the person just doesn't like you. That could happen. Mm-hmm. But to know how to answer, to know how to deal with, which is one of the reasons also I wrote the book as a series of letters, to give people that chance to understand that what to do.
Can you speak about the fraught relationship between Jews and the Black community? What can be done to bring the communities together? To which I will add that every other day, it seems, a Hasidic Jew is beaten up in Crown Heights, and there's almost no press coverage of it.
Right. It's a real problem. It's a very real problem. The relationship between the African American community and the Jewish community has been tension-laden for a very long time. Maybe Ocean Hill-Brownsville, it goes back to the New York City teachers' strike, even earlier. We can't delude ourselves into saying, oh, we were so good to the African Americans, why are they doing this to us? We supported when Jews worked very hard in the civil rights movement. I would argue most did it because they really believed in the cause, and they believed this is something that we know, we've got to help others. I think we've got to stay in the fray. There are members of the African community, just like there are members on the right and on the left of political parties, for whom it will be useless to try to change their minds. But I think we have to stay there. But there are limits. And I wrote this in Hadassah magazine about the Women's March. I said it at an ADL meeting in the beginning of December, that a deal breaker is when you call me a termite. Because what do you do when you have termites? Who do you call?
Exterminators.
See under Nazis. So. No, the analogy is too great.
Let's just push this a little further. I feel like I would love for you to speak to the way that it seems, and I don't think this is unique to the Black community. I think this is just happening more broadly. It seems that there's a way in which the racial politics of the United States are being exported and pasted onto a foreign conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
That's right.
And it's a perverse
analogy. It's a very perverse analogy. When you start talking about the early Zionists as colonizers, They were they were very brave people who schlepped in from Russia with, fighting malaria. These are hardly the colonizers. Were there mistakes made, as I said earlier? Of course there were mistakes made. But to westernize it, to some degree, Edward Said, this is a legacy of Said, and it's a legacy of the USSR. They were the ones who created Zionism as racism, and spread it, and then the USSR went away, but these legacies were left there. But, it's just, I keep going back, it's a conundrum. I think we have to keep fighting it. The fact that, when you get Black Lives Matter, which is true, Black lives do matter, and to say all lives, of course all lives matter, but it was Black lives that were that overwhelmingly were seen as, and have been the objects of brutality by not all police officers, not all police forces, but we know that. But to just walk away from it, I think, is very hard. This is a tough battle, folks. And it would be easier to say, I'm walking away, finished with helping African Americans, finished with worrying about needy people, finished with all that. We can't afford it. We can't afford it because for strategic reasons in terms of fighting anti-Semitism. And to go back to the Oi versus Joy, we can't afford it because that's not who we are as a people. We are a people that worries. One of the most oft repeated verses in the Torah after, Shabbat and other thing is the watch out for the ger and the yatom and the almanah, the stranger and the orphan and the widow, the vulnerable people in your midst, because you were once vulnerable and you know what that's about. It doesn't mean only do that. It doesn't mean let yourself be walked over and abused, but care for them, reach out to them, hold up to those ideals. Comment please on J Street. I don't agree with all of J Street's positions at all, but the demonization of J Street is beyond all measure. There was a meeting held at the UN. It was Jewish groups, but happened to be the venue was at the UN Conference Center, and it was a student meeting about BDS. And there were J Street students there who first, when they arrived, were told by security it wasn't so smart for them to be wearing their J Street t-shirts because they couldn't assure their security in a meeting of 1,200 Jewish students. And then one student stood up to ask a question. And the speaker happened to be a state legislator from South Carolina, who was one of the leading fighters against BDS. And the student said, look, we oppose BDS. She identified herself as a J Street student. We oppose BDS, but we also opposed Israel's, she called it occupation of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. And how do we differentiate between our opposition to BDS in general and that? And when she identified herself as from J Street, he said, oh, that's the most anti-Semitic organization. And these other students began to cheer. It's a craziness. You don't have to agree with the policies, but it's a voice. It's a voice that you find in Israel, a voice on the left, number one. Number two, I recently appeared on with Todd Gitlin and others from Columbia University, and there was a graduate student there who was doing her PhD pro-Israel, she spent lots of time in Israel in the Middle East department, so she put herself in the belly of the beast. And she said, politically, she does not agree with J Street at all, but she said the students with the most street cred with the liberal students on campus are the J Street students, So I think this demonization of J Street, it makes as much sense about talking as George Soros, as I've heard many people do in shul and in other places, as a Nazi. He was 14 years old, during the regime. His parents hid him with a Hungarian official whose job it was to go and collect some of the belongings of Jews. So you now have Jews saying, oh, he was a Nazi, because they want to demonize him. We've got to be so careful about falling into those, easy slogans, but not helpful.
Do you think if the occupation ended tomorrow and there was an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank, would it change any of these dynamics that we've been talking about tonight?
Doubtful. It would change some of them. But that's why I think that for a lot of people, it either is a foil for anti-Semitism or it has become anti-Semitism.
Your middle name is Esther, which is a detail I love because I think of you as a bit of a Queen Esther. I'm wondering if you identify with that and how you see yourself, and do you see yourself the way that we see you?
You know, the night of when I won the trial, I went back after it was on the BBC, and I was doing all sorts of stuff very late. I got back to my apartment, and I made the mistake of turning on my emails, and of course they came pouring out of the computer. But one of them said simply this: Book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 9, or whatever it is. Didn't know what it was, so I, quickly found the Tanakh, called someone, and it's the story in the Book of Esther where Mordecai has been sitting in front of the palace in sackcloth and ashes, mourning because his people are about to be destroyed. And Esther hears about it and sends him out fresh clothing. He says, that's not the problem. I don't need the fresh clothing. And he sends her a message that she's got to go to Ahasuerus. We know the story. And she sends back, I can't go, because if you go to be summoned, you could die. He could, and he doesn't, you can only go if the king summons you. And Mordecai has no patience for this. All her people's future existence is on the line, and she's worried about her head. And he says to her, Al tadami b'nafshech, don't imagine that you'll be saved and the rest of your people will be destroyed. Your fate is with them. And then he says, and if you don't do it, revach v'hatzalah ya'amod la'yehudim mimakom acher, salvation will come to the Jews from someplace else. And then finally he said, Umi yodea im le'et kazot tigat lamalchut. Who knows if not for this very reason, you became queen. Now, when this person said that to me and I realized or sent me that connection, it resonated. Not that I think, being sued by the world's leading Holocaust denier is to be queen of anything, or not to be, or to spend 3.5 years writing a book and trying to make it really accessible so that people, not just my 10 scholarly friends will read it, but that it'll be widely read. A book to educate people on anti-Semitism is being the queen of being the explicator of anti-Semitism. But who knows if not for this reason, I got to be where I am, to reach people, to write, to teach, just like you, and many of us are looking to you as well, to say the things that people said, I always thought that, but I needed someone to say it. It doesn't always make you, as you well know, it doesn't always make you popular, but I think it's worth doing. I think it's imperative that we do it, and as I said earlier, not just for the sake of the Jews, and not just for the sake of fighting prejudice, but for the sake of the healthy democracies that I think we treasure very much.
One last question.
Yeah.
Who are your Jewish heroes?
Who are my Jewish heroes? Devorah, Esther, and there's some lay people. One of my heroes, in many respects, was someone I had the privilege to teach Torah to, and I mentioned him earlier, was Edgar Bronfman. We sat and we would study, every once in a while we would study Torah, and he was ailing, but the last thing I studied with him were Rambam's Maimonides' Hilchot Tshuva, the Laws of Repentance. And I remember how he marveled. There's one point in there where Rambam says, Maimonides quotes the verse from Bereshit, from Genesis, right after Adam and Eve had eaten from the apple, or from the tree, and the voice of the angels or someone says, "Hein ha'adam haya ke'echad mimenu ladat tov me'ra," which can be now like man is like one of us to know the difference between right and wrong. And Rambam does something very eloquent. When you can change a meaning eloquently with a simple thing, he puts a full stop after ke'echad. Hein ha'adam haya ke'echad. Now humans are unique. Mimeno, from within themselves, they know the difference between right and wrong. You can train a dog. You can't train a cat, but you can train a dog. You can train a monk. You can train lots of animals, but they don't know from within themselves the difference between right and wrong. Humans do. And I hope that ultimately there'll be enough humans who will understand the difference of right and wrong in so many respects, but certainly also in terms of anti-Semitism.
As always, this was such a pleasure, and I hope everyone buys the book.